So previously I talked about some of the worst torture methods, and as a joke towards the end I said that you should include your favorite picks if I didn't mention it, and wow, you guys really delivered. I will say that a lot of what was written in the comments I have heard of them before, but most of them were execution methods. And that's exactly what we'll be looking at today. Molten Gold. Something like this was actually seen in Game of Thrones. In one episode in the first season, one man gets killed by having molten gold poured over him. But in real life, it's actually a lot worse. There have been a few historical cases where people would have hot gold poured down their throat. At first it might seem kind of like a weird and expensive thing to do, but in a lot of cases it was actually done with hot lead, which probably isn't any less painful, but more cost effective. There was one case in 1599 where a Spanish governor, who was in charge of a certain area of the Amazon, cheated the native tribe out of a lot of money by taxing the gold trade unfairly. When they found out about it, they weren't too happy and started a brutal revolt where they killed thousands of Spanish people in the local settlement. Then they took the governor and allegedly poured molten gold in his mouth, killing him with the object of his own greed. You might wonder how this even kills you, as the answer isn't that obvious. Well, in a study performed almost 20 years ago, researchers found out that it's most likely the steam that ends up killing you. When molten gold is poured in your larynx, it instantly begins cooking your throat and very quickly solidifies, choking you. Then large amounts of vapor are produced which start shooting in both directions, leading to your organs exploding. Sawed in half. This one is a lot simpler, but honestly I cannot even imagine how much pain this would be. The images alone are enough to make you wonder what the hell people were thinking when they did this, and why is there always a crowd of people watching? It's unclear how old the idea of sawing someone in half exactly is, because apparently people have been doing it forever. In medieval Europe, this punishment was used only in particularly heinous cases of crime, and it was often performed in public squares to serve as a warning. The victim's slow and painful death was meant to be a deterrent against unlawful behavior. The most common version involved the condemned person being tied down or restrained, usually in public, to make a gruesome spectacle. Even though there were different approaches to sawing people in half, such as chopping by the waist, the one we tend to see in the pictures comes from ancient Morocco. And before anyone asks, yes, they started at the groin and went from there. The old pictures are quite strange in my opinion, like this one. Why are they laughing? By the way, there's apparently only one case where it was specifically recorded that the man sawed in half was hung upside down. But I seriously doubt that it was the only case. I mean, I can't even imagine how much work it would be to saw a guy upwards. When you research this method, it's quite interesting because you can see different cultures' versions of this execution method. Interestingly enough though, it seems like humans everywhere came to the same conclusions that this was an acceptable thing to do. Blood Eagle. This was a ritual that originates from the Viking period, and it's really strange. It's one of those methods that really highlights the dark nature of human history, as it shows how much effort and thought went into hurting each other in arguably the most creative ways possible. The Blood Eagle involved stripping the victim, laying them face down, and then cutting their back open to expose their rib cage. The executioner would then pull the victim's lungs out through the wounds, resembling majestic wings. This gruesome act was intended to symbolize the rebirth of the condemned soul as an eagle, an animal revered by Vikings for its connection to the divine. Some argue that the blood eagle was more symbolic than an actual execution method, and was merely invented to strike fear into the hearts of the enemies. Skeptics add that it might have been more like a literary device, like an exaggeration to enhance dramatic storytelling. In recent years, though, archaeological discoveries have added to the debate, as skeletal remains have been found that show evidence of back injuries consistent with the blood eagle. Honestly, when I read that it was physiologically possible, I knew that at one point or another, let's be honest, someone had to have done it. There's a show called Vikings, I haven't watched it, but in one scene, we see what the end result of this ritual looks like. And it's pretty horrifying, especially when you consider that the person was still alive during this. Scaphism. Scaphism, also known as the boats, was a truly nightmarish and extremely gross execution method practiced in ancient Persia. This method involved a multi-stage process of extreme torture and suffering. First, the victim would be securely fastened between two narrow boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, with only their head, hands, and feet protruding. They would then be force-fed a mixture of milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. This combination served a dual purpose. It provided nourishment to keep the victim alive, which of course prolongs the suffering, and it created a wretched environment within the confines of the boats. You know, there's no bathroom breaks. They're sitting in the filth. As time passed, the victim's waste would accumulate inside the confined space, attracting insects and vermin. This vile concoction then led to infection and dehydration. The relentless agony could last for days or even weeks. What? The physical and psychological torment inflicted by Scaphism is almost beyond comprehension. Victims would endure dehydration, hunger, and mental anguish as they lay there unable to escape their fate. Death, when it finally came, was more like a release from the torture. Scaphism was not just a brutal execution, it was also a method of public humiliation and deterrence. The spectacle of a person slowly deteriorating in this grotesque manner was meant to prevent others from committing similar crimes. Flaying. This is the act of removing someone's skin while they're still alive. It can also be done after death, but if you do that, I mean, what's the point, you know? Flaying can be traced back to the earliest human civilizations. During the medieval period in Europe, flaying was occasionally used as a method of public execution. It was typically used for people who were found guilty of crimes such as regicide or treason against the monarchy. Executioners would meticulously remove the skin from the victim's body, often while they were still alive, ensuring the death was slow and excruciatingly painful. One notorious historical example of flaying is the execution of William Wallace, the Scottish knight who led the First War of Scottish Independence against England in the late 13th century. After being captured, Wallace faced a gruesome end. He was hanged, drawn, a form of disembowelment, and quartered, with flaying as the final step. His skin was removed and pieces of it were displayed as gruesome trophies throughout England. There's another case in England where in 1303 Westminster Abbey was robbed, and after finding the perpetrators they were skinned alive as well. I think a lot of people underestimate how painful this would actually be because it sounds so ridiculous that you just can't imagine it. Lethal injection. This is something that, until I saw John Oliver doing a piece on it a few years ago, I had no idea that it could be painful at all. Lethal injection is often portrayed as a humane and painless method of execution, but the reality is far more complex. While it is designed to be less cruel than traditional execution methods like electrocution or, pouring gold in a person's face, there is a growing body of evidence suggesting that lethal injection can be far from painless. Lethal injection was introduced in the late 20th century by J. Chapman, an Oklahoma medical examiner, in 1977. The idea was to administer a series of drugs that would induce unconsciousness, paralysis, and ultimately cardiac arrest, resulting in medical death. This method was meant to minimize suffering and make executions more palatable to the public. The most commonly used method of lethal injection involves a 3-drug protocol. The victim is first administered an anesthetic to induce unconsciousness. Next up is a paralytic agent to paralyze the muscles and stop respiration. Finally, potassium chloride is injected to induce cardiac arrest. The problem with this protocol lies in the potential for error. If the anesthetic fails to induce deep unconsciousness, the person may experience intense pain and suffering while being paralyzed, but fully aware of it. People who survived this said that it feels like fire in your veins while drowning. During botched procedures, the victims would be unable to communicate their pain due to the paralytic agent, which is a lot of people's worst nightmare. One of the most notorious cases occurred in Oklahoma in 2014, where the prisoner gasped and moaned after the drugs were administered, leading to a prolonged and painful execution. So while lethal injection was introduced with the intention of providing a more humane form of execution, when not done correctly, it can be one of the worst. Breaking wheel. This device has its origins in medieval Europe, big surprise, and was an especially notorious method of executing criminals, particularly those convicted of the most serious crimes such as murder. The earliest documented cases of the breaking wheel date back to the 11th century. This was a multi-step process that aimed to prolong the victim's suffering before delivering a final fatal blow. Here's how it typically worked. The condemned person would be bound to a large wooden wheel or wagon wheel, usually face up or face down depending on the specific variation of the method used. Their limbs would be stretched out, rendering them completely vulnerable. Executioners would then proceed to shatter the victim's bones systematically using heavy wooden mallets or iron bars. They would start with the limbs striking at the joints and breaking the bones without immediately causing death. After their limbs were broken, the executioners would deliver a final fatal blow to the chest or head, ending their life. Executions using the breaking wheel were often public spectacles. Why? With crowds of onlookers witnessing the brutal, gruesome process. Seriously, what is it with people back then always watching this stuff? Were they so bored? Was that it? Did they just have nothing to do, so they watched people get broken in half? Because I'd rather do nothing than watch that. Immurement. This practice involves sealing a person, often alive, within an enclosed space, typically a tomb, inside a wall or a cell where they are left to die in darkness and isolation. Immurement was carried out in several ways depending on the culture and context. In some cases, individuals were sealed alive in crypts where they were left to starve or run out of breathable air. In other instances, people were walled into small chambers or cells, often within monasteries, castles, or prisons, effectively condemning them to a lifetime of isolation. Sometimes these people would be fed to be kept alive, which is an incredibly inhumane psychological punishment, which leads to a very slow death. There are many different aspects which make this method so awful. There's always complete darkness. The victims locked in the chambers would be isolated in total blackness and couldn't see anything, which greatly added to the psychological torment. Then, much like with Scaphism, there is the issue with bathroom breaks, as in, there weren't any. It just sort of collected over a long time. Jesus, if I die like this, make up a different story. Also, since people don't want to waste a bunch of space, these were typically very small spaces that you'd be locked in. This is like 3 of the worst torture methods combined, which last until you die. So those were some of the worst execution methods ever. I feel like I need to take a shower. As always, I hope you guys liked it. If you did, smash like, smash subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye, guys.